Hi, this is Matt Rota, and this is what makes art great. In this episode, we're looking at the work of Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell is considered one of the legendary illustrators from the golden age of American illustration in the early 20th century. He's most famous for his work for the Saturday Evening Post, having created 321 covers over his 47-year career. His first cover was published in 1916, when he was only 22 years old. He also worked with other prominent magazines throughout his career, including Boy's Life, which was the official magazine for the Boy Scouts of America, Life magazine, Country Gentleman, and many others. Although he considered himself an illustrator, he was trained as a fine artist at the Art Students League in New York City. His teachers included the famous Frank Drummond, who studied at the Académie Julian in Paris, and George Bridgman, who also studied in France under the famous Orientalist painter Jerome. Bridgman is most notable for his role in developing the academic tradition of American realism, which can clearly be seen as an influence in Rockwell's work. Due to advances in photo reproduction in the early part of the 20th century, color painting was able for the first time to be mechanically reproduced for the masses. This brought painters to a much wider audience due to the popularity of magazines and print media in America at that time. Rockwell, along with his contemporaries like J.C. Leyendecker and Dean Cornwell, embraced this new method for print production as both a means for bringing their work to a much wider audience and also for much more financial stability in their careers. Artists like Leyendecker, Frederick Remington, Charles Dana Gibson were all meeting casually at this time in restaurants in New York like Mukin's, the Roma, Café Lafayette, and also Hotel Brevoort. These dinners were excellent opportunities for professionals to meet one another and discuss day-to-day business dealings, price ranges, things that affected their industry at the time. In 1901, 9 illustrators and 1 businessman founded the Society of Illustrators from those early informal dinners. That group would eventually include Rockwell, who would go on to become its first inductee into the Hall of Fame in 1958. Much of the commercial illustration of the period, and most memorably those of Rockwell, typically depicted what was popularly thought of as the ideal of American day-to-day life, which was more idealized, in fact, than it was ideal. Magazines rarely ran photos or illustrations of culturally diverse people on their covers, and in the case of the Saturday Evening Post, unfortunately only did so when the minority was in a servile or subservient role. So this ideal was focused on what publication editors felt was safe for print and comfortable viewing for the largely white, affluent middle class that was reading the magazines at the time. Rockwell's understanding of print was evident in his technical style, which catered to the photographic reproduction process. For example, Rockwell liked to mix dirt into his paint to create this relief effects that cast shadows and added texture. The Christmas coach was painted in California during the summer of 1935 and reproduced as a spread in December's Saturday Evening Post. The work depicts a joyful winter ride on a crowded English mail coach from the 19th century. The scene is of an unlikely cast of characters returning home or going to visit their family for Christmas. The themes capture many of Rockwell's hallmarks: family and reunion, nostalgia for a bygone era. It has the earnest awe of a mother and son looking out of the window at the scenery as it goes by from the inside of the coach. It has the drunkenness of a sailor merrily cheering, a stiff regal couple trying hard to ignore him. At the front of the coach, there's a short, stout rider who's nervously clutching the handles, sitting next to the lanky, confident driver. At the back of the coach, you have an elderly couple that are cringing at the young mail guard who's blowing his post horn in their faces. The painting has been a part of the Society of Illustrators' permanent collection since shortly after they moved into the early clubhouse on West 24th Street. The painting can now be seen above their bar on the 3rd floor of the Museum of Illustration at 128 East 63rd Street in New York City. Rockwell was always very focused on his characters. At this point in his career, he primarily worked from live models, which is indicative of his early training as a realist painter in the tradition of the classical masters. He would have them in costume from which he would create a number of beautiful charcoal sketches. He went through a long process of editing down and simplifying and bringing out more of the character of each individual person, really emphasizing the personality and distorting their features, almost creating caricatures out of them to help with the storytelling. He would transfer those drawings onto his canvas, and then he would paint directly onto the canvas from there. In the Christmas coach, you can see the effects this process had on his work. His models would have been dressed in winter clothing in the middle of a California summer, so you can see the result of the rosy cheeks and the sweat still dripping off of their forehead from the models that's reproduced in the painting. You can also see how the intended use of the magazine as a spread affected the composition. Half of the spread has its own composition that works on its own page, but the motion of the characters as we flow from one individual to the other connects both compositions. Later in his career, under the influence of his third wife, Mary Lee Molly Punderson, Rockwell began to see the potential his role could play in advocating for social change. In 1961, his piece, Do Unto Others, which was a cover for the Saturday Evening Post, was the first notable example of Rockwell's evolving social consciousness, became a major departure for the Saturday Evening Post. The work depicts a group of people from many different cultures and religions. The characters were drawn from photographs he'd taken on a round-the-world trip in 1955. And he referenced many of the native costumes to really heighten the sense of realism and pared down the sense of caricature and cartooniness. Despite putting this iconic work on the cover, the Post was really slow to depart from their conservative attitude. That forced Rockwell to look for other outlets for this sort of work that he was doing at this time. He would move at that point to Look magazine, where he was allowed to explore the subject of race more directly. His covers at this time include the famous The Problem That We All Live With, which was published in 1965, painted in response to the violent reaction to Ruby Bridges' integration of her local New Orleans elementary school in 1960. Southern Justice was published in 1965, painted in response to the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi a year prior. New Kids in the Neighborhood, published in 1967, uses black and white children to highlight the tension of housing integration in the suburbs. In 1977, Rockwell received the nation's highest civil honor, the prestigious Medal of Freedom. He died peacefully at his home in Stockbridge on November 8, 1978, at the age of 84.